Chapter 1. Cutting the Red Tape. Sometimes one's daydreams cease to live in the imagination. When that occurs, it may be due to one of two causes. Either one's taste has changed, or else one has reached the point immediately preceding fulfillment. The latter is what happened to us. When I say us, I mean my wife and myself. For months we had been besieged by a sense of restlessness, which at first we were unable to account for. Now, looking back on it, I realize that it had all started one day in 1950, when we had been engaged in making some archaeological excavations in a pre-Columbian settlement at the top of a mountain in Antco, in the province of Tayacaj, Peru. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and although the sun was at the zenith, the atmosphere was rapidly cooling owing to the effect of the great height and of the gentle breeze that was blowing. We decided to stop working, and after issuing coca leaves to the Indians, who were of Quichuan origin, we sat down to contemplate and to admire the ever-varying chains of rock of the Royal Andes. By coincidence, the sun's rays lit up a ravine to the east, leading to the jungle. This prompted my wife to remark, "Archaeology is exciting, all right, but how much more interesting it would be to find human beings in an absolutely primitive state who would allow us to live among them and study them." I remember I answered to the effect that archaeological exhumations did not involve any danger, whereas to intrude where the white man was not wanted was a hazardous adventure. It is strange how the mind, with the passing of the years, plays tricks on one, ironical sometimes and generally contradictory, for I believe it was on that day that an idea captivated my subconscious and was never to let it go of it. In 1954 we left Uruguay for Bolivia, abandoning the beneficent civilizing influence of the Quichua and Aymara peoples, to penetrate into Urupana and approach the Amazonian basin of the River Beni to make a study of the Lecos and Urupe Indian tribes. These were not then aggressive or belligerent Indians. They traded by barter with the gatherers of raw rubber and the small farmsteaders. However, the Bolivian government took the most zealous care to see that they were not cheated. Their lands had remained closed for many years as a consequence of an unscrupulous expedition having ill-treated the inhabitants. Needless to say, that expedition met with a disastrous end, but time and the self-denying devotion of Salesian and Jesuit missionaries had acted like a soothing balm. Our previous travels had been planned on the basis of confirmed data, seconded and supported by ethnologists and anthropologists of proven experience. But now our tranquil little world had been shaken, and the first small ripple of approaching events appeared in its smooth surface. One day I happened to refer, in all innocence, to a long-term future plan, and to envisage a theoretical penetration into unexplored regions. That was enough. My wife promptly championed the idea, which became our favorite topic of conversation. I was fully conscious of the fact that, whereas on our former travels, there existed only the perils peculiar to the jungle, in this case the danger would be multiplied by a coefficient which was totally incalculable. And indeed, how could we possibly calculate the risk, since we should be entering an unknown zone where the belligerent native was a law unto himself and absolute master of those lands? I tried with all my willpower to oppose my wife's insistence, but gradually her reasoning undermined my rooted fears as to the happy outcome of the expedition. The companionship and reciprocal loyalty which had united us for years had a decisive effect, as did the knowledge that the hardships and drudgery of an expedition would be shared. Contact with virgin nature and constant peril may create in civilized man an unbalanced state of mind. Unfortunately, when that happens, one does not realize it until it is too late. The companion on this kind of adventure must be one who is proven capable of enduring the ups and downs, always trying and unforeseen of confronting the virgin jungle, with its daily torments of insects and minor discomforts. That companion is destined to be the pivot on which the expedition turns, and which must bear the greatest tension, so that upon him depends success or failure. For in a small-scale expedition, one man less may mean that the fate of the whole thing is sealed. Fortunately, my wife embraced all the indispensable requirements. Apart from the natural ties which bound me to her, ties ideal in the extreme, for I was intimately acquainted with her slightest reactions, knowing them to be temperate and well-balanced. To this was added another psychological factor on which to rest the highest hopes. I had confidence in the power of matrimony, or the unity of the family, as the savage understands it, so that the latter would be likely to accept our incursion into his territory without suspicion. This theory of mine was not based upon anything scientific, but upon practical experience. I had noticed that the native in his own natural medium, when he moves into a friendly area where he has no reason to anticipate animosity, takes his wife and children with him without the slightest misgiving. As we analyzed this state of mind in the Indian, we felt quite sure that our guest would not prove wrong. Our objective was to be comparatively unexplored virgin jungle of the central Mato Grosso in Brazil, in the region of the Rio das Mortes, River of the Dead, in the south and east. In this we received the full support of the government of Uruguay, thus becoming an official mission. But what really counted was the spirit in which we entered the world of jungle dwellers who had the reputation of being dreaded warriors. This knowledge could not be acquired from any textbooks, but only from personal experience which we should gain as events developed. We could only provide against the predictable. No serious study had been made either by Brazil's Service for the Protection of the Indians or by its scientifically allied organization, the Indian Museum. All the information differed in its essentials, even that given to me personally by Francisco Mireles, who, as pacifier of the Indians, had justly earned an enormously high reputation in 1946 when he had been able to secure a rapprochement with a part of the Zavante tribe of the Mato Grosso. Some years had now elapsed since that promising contact, and this great tribe was shunning the white man as if it had done of old. Opinions concerning the Zavantes were discordant, and the smatterings of their vocabulary which had been accumulated were few. This was not surprising, because these natives were known to differ greatly from the rest. They were no kin to the docile jungle dweller, who, complying with the will of the white man, in a short time degenerated in body and soul, nor were they united by any ties to the Indians whom they were displacing, so as to avoid coming face to face with civilized man, or with those Indians who were getting even with civilization for its injustices of seizure of women and enslavement of men by attacking small settlements of colonists to carry off their women and children. They remained true to their age-old heritage as warrior nomads, as pure in breed and as wild as on the day when Christopher Columbus first glimpsed the New World. They have moved about in their natural setting, guided by the abundance of game. They have covered immense distances and imposed their frontiers. They did not practice motiveless cruelty, killing for the sake of killing, they only annihilated those who, taking no heed of their warnings, faced up to them in battle. The Zavante is an innate warrior, and being a hunter by vocation, became a nomad involuntarily. All these natural attributes had given him qualities which distinguish his from the other tribes: haughtiness, pride, and loyalty. Of course, this was not known to us before we came in contact with him, but we perceived that behind the vagueness with which our questions met, there must exist an exceptional being within that formidable exterior which men regarded as that of a mere warlike nomadic hunter. Days passed dizzily by, and the weeks lengthened into months, as we went on preparing our equipment. The third companion who made up our expedition, and who never left us, was an undesirable character called Hard Work. And that spectre that haunted us for more than 7 months was the weight of things we proposed to take with us. Endless lists were slowly reduced more and more. What should we take? What could we leave behind? What was most indispensable? Medicaments, dehydrated foods, anti-typhoid serum, vitamins, films for our cameras, waterproof aluminum containers, suitable clothing, tarpaulins, oil lamps, munitions, presents for the Indians, all these, and 101 other things, were subjected to a thorough scrutiny before being included in our equipment. Every ounce counted, and so all the cinematograph material. The film cameras and the tripods were meticulously placed on the scales. Great and disconcerting was our surprise to find that we greatly exceeded our estimates. We had to make a careful selection twice more before the weight of our equipment was within what we considered reasonable limits. 200 kilos in all, about 400 weight. Aluminum and plastic had replaced other metals. Dehydrated foods took the place of canned preserves. Light canvas sheets displaced tents and hammocks, bulky sleeping bags. Every single one of our objects of equipment underwent a detailed inspection. To this had to be added the arduous task of obtaining specially prepared vitamins and foodstuffs. The success or otherwise of our painstaking efforts in this respect would be attested by our experience in the jungle and by the fact that we should be going in search of warlike tribes to regions in which we should have to be self-supporting for months, with no one and nothing to aid us. How many times we thought enviously of expeditions setting out with numerous bearers, oxen and wagons, or asses for transportation, and of how fortunate it would be if we could include in the equipment all the things we considered essential. But then our imagination stopped short at the thought of the sad end of such expeditions in those parts. Their slow progress led to the jettisoning of their heavier encumbrances when the jungle intervened too tenaciously, the abandonment of the beast of burden when swamps were encountered, or the constant changing of the route to elude topographical hazards, only to return later reduced in numbers and with depleted equipment. That is, if the Indians did not decimate them from the cover of the jungle. We believed there was only one way to overcome the numerous unfavorable circumstances of a region extremely perilous in itself, and so we went ahead, determined to carry out our own prearranged plan. It was a hot February in 1956 when we left hospitable Montevideo for an uncertain destination. At last we were leaving, faced with that glowing reality. We forgot the feverishly intense preparations. So intense and so prolonged had they been that the last 3 days we devoted entirely to a well-earned rest, both physical and spiritual. Our small but roomy truck had been selected with careful forethought. Not only would it save us trouble and time in Rio de Janeiro, and would conveniently take care of the equipment, but also it would, we thought, simplify the customs formalities, for our equipment was so heterogeneous it would have aroused suspicion in the most easygoing customs officers. which, in fact, it did, with a consequent loss of valuable time. Norma was radiant. She loves heat and the sea, and was in her seventh heaven at the mere thought of Rio's beaches. It seemed, as we crossed the frontier, that the climate changed. A torrential rain beat down upon us all day long. We put up at the hotel in Copacabana on the Esplanade so as to have the sea at hand and go for a dip as soon as the sun should come out. The greenish sea was wrinkled and grooved with snow-white spume and whipped by fine persistent drizzle. It all had a disillusioning effect upon Norma. Day after day we religiously got our bathing costumes and wraps ready, but this patience and persistence went on for 7 whole days. During this time there was no indication that we could make a move or seriously begin the negotiations and paperwork of bureaucracy with a view to obtaining the relevant documents. I made a courtesy visit to present my credentials at my country's embassy. Then I began making contacts with those from whom I at first received nothing but vexation. 3 visits to the Service for the Protection of the Indians, 2 visits to Itamaraty, the Ministry of Foreign Relations, to ask officially for collaboration in my mission, a visit to the President of the Central Brazil Foundation, and to the Director of the Indian Museum, on which the OK for all scientific expeditions into the interior to make contact with the natives depends. Their non-cooperation left a feeling of positive and alarming uneasiness concerning all our projects. One more visit to the embassy had no transcendental effect on all my negotiations. I could not help heaving a sigh as I received all the unflattering fuss and bother of the first week and thought of those 9 cases of expedition material lying down below in the hotel storeroom. I believed I should meet with close scientific collaboration, given with fraternal and helpful sympathy, for a mission commended by my government. The fact was that we were being immobilized, and we had no idea whom to rely upon for salvation. I discovered the answer to that by chance at the end of the 2nd week. There had been 4 more visits to the Director of the Service for the Protection of the Indians, an interview with the President of the Central Brazil Foundation, 2 visits to the Presidential Palace Diplomatic Relations Section, 5 visits to the Embassy, 2 to the National Council for the Indians, and finally 1 more to the Indian Museum. And herein lay the clue to our troubles. The director of the Indian Museum in 1956 was a gentleman who considered himself a scientific ethnologist. His attitude was aggressive and I considered unhelpful to the country he represented. He seemed unwilling to tolerate having a student of ethnology, much less a foreigner, penetrate into Brazilian virgin zones. In a most offhand manner he supplied me with false data, exaggerating dangers, and objecting to our risking our lives. He turned what should have been clear and high-level scientific information into an intricate game of confused and lofty-sounding words, and in the end offered to put at my disposal airplanes and land and water transportation facilities if I would desist from my purpose and investigate other zones, like the island of Bananal, inhabited by Karja, Zarinti, Tapirep, and Jave Indians, the Amazon River and adjacent areas where dwell the Maku, Waiku, Tukana, Mahi, Tariana, Miridi, and other tribes, or in the state of Maranon, the region known for the Guaja and Urubus Indians. None of these regions satisfied me as material for study, or else they presented problems of accessibility little less than insurmountable. The island of Bananal and its approaches were abundantly well known and lacked features interesting to study from an ethnological point of view, because not only have the tribes living in that zone continual contact with the white man, but their tribal degeneration is complete with perhaps the exception of the Xirentis. The enormously widespread area of the Amazon River did not offer a compact front for the carrying out of a study that could lay claim to completeness. Besides, the facilities which the network of navigable waterways offered were an illusion, for the commercial activity attached to raw rubber caused the jungle dweller to retreat or to adopt semi-civilization. We should be running the risk of a long and tiring journey only to find a tribe that spoke Portuguese or possessed implements and clothing brought them by civilization. It would have been nonsensical to try to establish contact with those who shunned the white man. The search would have taken us more time than we had at our disposal, and there would have been no certainty that we would find what we were looking for. As for the zone of Maranon State, it did not fit in with my plans. The Indians of that territory were continually immigrating, and besides, the director of the Indian Museum had already begun a study of the Urubas, so that field could already be said to be covered. Needless to say, the director of the Indian Museum omitted to inform us about these studies already begun. The attitude of the director of the Indian Museum in similar cases to ours was much the same. For instance, Brian Fawcett's interest in undertaking a search for his father, and the interest of the Natural History Museum of New York in certain zones. Both found the same kind of limited response and lack of support, which fact had been amply commented on in press at the time, including the chief newspapers of Brazil itself. When I had confirmed that this person was the reef on which our efforts were foundering, I worked fast. I paid 3 visits to the Minister of Agriculture, Sir J. Dornell, the highest authority on whom all these institutions ultimately depend. When well informed in all aspects of the subject, he, with the kindness characteristic of this great sister republic, took firm and decisive steps. Now we had become acquainted with all the difficulties. Among them was that of obtaining a passage in the planes of the Brazilian Air Force. The so-called Bandeirante Explorer line started from Rio, and passing over civilization extended to Barra do Garzas, the Goiás Mato Grosso state limit, and from there on crossed over forbidden, unexplored territory to Xavantina, Yacaracanga, Cachimba, Santarém, and Manaus. Those points I have referred to, from Barra do Garzas to Manaus, were tiny bases in the immensity of the virgin jungle. In Cachimbo, workers on the making of a picada, a path or pass in the jungle, had just come across a village of Indians whose skins were black and who scraped off all their hair as a tribal characteristic, and of whom the centers of specialized study had no knowledge. This information was only given to us on our return by the commander-in-chief of Galao, Rio's military airport, Lieutenant Colonel Pedro de Freitas Ribeiro. All as these planes were supply transport, their load had to be reserved and assigned at least a month in advance. Everything they carried, including mail, was destined for the interior, to military air bases in the heart of the jungle, for the sustenance of the few residents inhabiting those distant regions. The freight they carried was of a wide assortment: petrol, machine spare parts, rice flour, sugar, paraffin, arms and ammunition, hens, pigs, and from time to time mules or cows. The passenger list comprised people who were close kin to those who manned those points, and persons directly connected with the service. It was very difficult for us to obtain passages, and virtually impossible to secure accommodation for the freight we were taking with us as equipment. Once again, freight and weight were a major worry to us. The service for the protection of the Indians counts on a definite weight allowance on all those flights for its own cargo, as does also the Central Brazil Foundation. Its director had told us that for the whole of the month and until the middle of the next, we could not depend on the availability of cargo space. That news was a further blow to our hopes, even more serious than those we had been enduring daily in Rio. No privately chartered plane could land in that region. It was forbidden to do so, and severe penalties were laid down for those who infringed the regulation. The only aircraft authorized to land there were those of the Brazilian Air Force. The problem appeared to be insoluble until we spoke to the Minister of Agriculture. His influence worked like lightning. We were able to dispense with most of the permits which are usually insisted upon, and we obtained passages in the very next plane and cargo space for our equipment. And we asked the National Council for the Indians for the appropriate approval of our mission. They demanded a name. List had to be made for our organization, enumerating the material equipment, the probable route, the tribes to be visited, and the agreement by each member of the expedition to furnish a copy of every item of ethnological value for the approbation of the exigent Brazilian scientist. A key name of the expedition enables the institution to file and identify it, putting it on a map of the region so as to keep a tab on it in case of any untoward contingency, for the zone was classified as unsafe. The name in question given by the organization was not hard to invent. We were going to the Mato Grosso, so there was no better name to call us than Expedition Mato Grosso. Thus christened, we armed with a receipt of approval for the state authorities for the carrying of firearms, we were freed from obstacles. We had often wondered what would be the best way for us to take leave of civilization. We were agreed that when the moment came, gaiety and celebrations would be in order, but contrary to all that we had foreseen, we had to be content with making our final farewell in the airport itself. Within one day the plane was leaving. Of those last 24 hours I have a clear recollection, nailing up and unnailing chests, with the consequent shock to the people in the room next door, painting on the containers the destination and name of the expedition, packing suitcases with our city clothes to be deposited in the hotel, taking the boxes to the airport, and leaving the truck in a place of safety. We were taking off at 4:45 in the morning. According to our traveling clock, it was already 2:30, and we were still too busy struggling through our preparation to be able to snatch time for a nap.